Welcome to Silent Screams, where the quiet of the night unravels the most terrifying tales. Tonight, we'll dive into 3 chilling stories of being alone at night. Are you ready to feel the weight of the shadows, to hear the whispers in the silence? Let's begin. It started with a quiet night. Julia had the house to herself, a rare occurrence she usually relished. She wrapped herself in a soft blanket, the glow of the television flickering across the walls of her living room. The clock ticked past midnight, and outside, the world seemed still, unnaturally so. As she scrolled through her phone, her attention was drawn to the faint creaking of the floorboards upstairs. She froze. It was an old house, prone to settling, but this was different. The sound was rhythmic, deliberate, like footsteps. She told herself it was nothing, just her mind playing tricks. But the creaks persisted, growing closer to the staircase. Her heart pounded as she muted the TV. The silence that followed was deafening. Julia's breath hitched as she saw a shadow shift at the top of the stairs. She grabbed her phone, the screen casting a dim light, and whispered into it, calling her best friend. The line rang and rang but went unanswered. Then, from the stairway, a soft voice called her name. Paralyzed, Julia couldn't respond. The voice was faint, almost melodic, and yet entirely unfamiliar. Summoning her courage, she stood and moved toward the front door. As she reached for the knob, the lights in the house flickered, and the voice came again, louder, angrier. It felt like the walls were closing in, the air thick with a presence she couldn't see but could feel. Julia bolted out of the house, the cold night air hitting her like a slap. She glanced back and saw the curtains fluttering, though the windows were shut tight. Across town, Miles was pulling into his driveway after a long shift. The quiet of his suburban neighborhood was comforting, a stark contrast to the chaos of the hospital where he worked. He parked, turned off the engine, and sat in the car for a moment, savoring the stillness. Then, from the corner of his eye, he noticed a figure standing under the street lamp near his house. It was a woman in a long, dark dress, her face obscured by shadow. Miles frowned, wondering why anyone would be out at this hour. He opened the car door, and when he looked back, she was gone. The unease followed him inside. The house was dark, save for the faint glow of the kitchen light he always left on. As he walked down the hall, he heard a faint tapping sound. He paused, listening. It came again, this time louder, from the direction of the living room. Miles clenched his fists, every muscle in his body tense. Slowly, he stepped into the room. The tapping stopped. His eyes scanned the space, landing on the window. There, pressed against the glass, was a handprint. It was smudged, as if someone had dragged their fingers across the pane. But the window was closed, locked from the inside. He backed away, his mind racing. Suddenly, his phone buzzed in his pocket, startling him. It was a text from an unknown number. It read, "You shouldn't be here." Panic gripped him as the tapping resumed, now faster, more insistent. He turned and ran upstairs, locking himself in his bedroom. But as he tried to call the police, the signal dropped, and the tapping turned into pounding. Meanwhile, Lisa, a college student, was working late at the library. The campus was almost deserted, the usual buzz of activity replaced by an eerie stillness. She loved the quiet, usually. It helped her focus. But tonight felt different. The rows of bookshelves seemed taller, the shadows between them darker. As she packed up her laptop, she heard the sound of a book falling, the thud echoing in the empty space. Lisa hesitated, her curiosity warring with her instinct to leave. She walked toward the sound, her footsteps loud against the tiled floor. At the end of the aisle, she found a book lying open on the ground. She picked it up, her fingers brushing against something sticky. Blood. She dropped the book in shock, stepping back. That's when she saw it, a figure standing at the far end of the aisle. It was a man, or at least, it looked like one. His face was pale, his eyes sunken, and he stood unnaturally still. Lisa's breath quickened as she backed away. But no matter how far she moved, the figure didn't grow smaller, as if the distance between them didn't exist. She turned and ran, her footsteps echoing in the empty library. When she reached the main doors, they wouldn't budge. She pounded on the glass, her screams swallowed by the silence. Behind her, the sound of footsteps grew louder, closer. She spun around, but the figure was gone. The library was empty. Or so it seemed. The night wore on, and each of them, Julia, Miles, and Lisa, would come to realize they were not alone. Something was watching, waiting, and its intentions were anything but benign. Julia stumbled through the neighborhood, her breath clouding in the cold night air. Every few steps, she glanced back at her house. The curtains were still fluttering, though no wind stirred the trees. Her chest tightened, a cold sweat running down her back. She fumbled for her phone again, her shaking fingers struggling to unlock it. She managed to call her sister this time, her voice barely a whisper as she explained what had happened. Her sister, Anna, tried to calm her down. "Stay with a neighbor," she urged. But when Julia looked around, every house seemed cloaked in darkness. No porch lights, no flickers of televisions behind windows. It was as if the entire street had gone silent, abandoned. She felt a chill creep up her spine, an overwhelming sense that she was being watched. Then, from the corner of her eye, she saw a figure standing under the street lamp. It wasn't the shadow from her house. This was something else. Tall, impossibly thin, its head cocked to the side as if studying her. Julia froze, her phone slipping from her hand and landing on the pavement with a muted thud. The figure didn't move, but the air around her grew heavy, oppressive. The sound of faint whispering filled her ears, though no one was there. She bent to grab her phone, and when she looked up, the figure was gone. Across town, Miles sat huddled in his bedroom. His breaths came in short, panicked bursts as he stared at the door, which rattled with each pounding knock. He had no weapon, no plan. His mind raced through every horror movie he'd ever seen, wondering if he was about to meet the same fate as so many unfortunate characters. The pounding stopped abruptly, leaving behind a suffocating silence. Miles didn't move, his ears straining for the faintest sound. Then, the door handle began to turn. He backed away, his heart hammering in his chest. The door creaked open, revealing nothing. The hallway beyond was dark, empty. But the air felt wrong, charged with something unseen. Miles reached for the flashlight on his nightstand and pointed it toward the door. The beam illuminated the walls, the floor, but not a single soul. He took a shaky step forward, his grip on the flashlight tightening. As he peered into the hallway, he noticed something strange. The family photos lining the walls were different. Faces were missing, replaced by empty black voids. The frame closest to him held a picture of his parents, but their expressions were twisted, mouths open in silent screams. Miles stumbled back into his room, slamming the door shut. He pressed his back against it, his breathing ragged. The whispers began then, faint at first, like a breeze slipping through cracks. But they grew louder, insistent, as if coming from every direction at once. Meanwhile, Lisa sat trembling in the library. She had managed to barricade herself in the small office at the back, the only space with a lockable door. Her pulse thundered in her ears, and she clutched a heavy book as her only weapon. The footsteps outside the office had stopped, but she could feel it, whatever it was, lingering just beyond the door. She stared at the faint glow of her phone, its battery at 5%. She needed help, but who would believe her? The thought of calling campus security seemed futile. What would she even say? Her phone buzzed, and her heart leapt. A message appeared from an unknown number. "Why are you hiding?" She dropped the phone, her breath catching in her throat. Then, slowly, almost imperceptibly, the doorknob began to twist. Lisa pressed herself against the far wall, gripping the book tightly. The door didn't open, but the sound of scratching began. Long, deliberate scrapes against the wood. It stopped suddenly, and the silence that followed was worse. Lisa strained to listen, every nerve in her body on edge. Then, a soft voice, barely more than a whisper, came through the crack beneath the door. It called her name. Lisa wanted to scream but bit her lip, tears streaming down her face. She shook her head, mouthing the words, "This isn't real." But the voice called again, more insistent. The lights in the office flickered, and a shadow passed under the door. It didn't belong to any human form she recognized. In another part of the city, Julia finally reached the nearest open convenience store. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, their harsh glow a welcome relief from the suffocating darkness outside. The cashier gave her a concerned look as she stumbled in, clutching her phone like a lifeline. She tried to explain what had happened, but her words tumbled out in a panicked jumble. The cashier nodded slowly, glancing toward the security camera screen behind the counter. Julia followed his gaze and froze. On the screen, the outside of the store was empty, except for the same tall figure standing at the edge of the parking lot. It was facing the store now, its head still cocked unnaturally to the side. Julia turned to look through the glass doors, but the parking lot was empty. She turned back to the screen, and the figure was gone. Miles, on the other hand, decided he couldn't stay in the house any longer. The whispers had grown louder, morphing into guttural growls that shook the very walls. He grabbed his car keys and bolted down the stairs, not daring to look behind him. As he reached the front door, he noticed something horrifying. The smudged handprint on the window was now smeared with a dark, red liquid. He threw the door open and ran to his car. As he sped down the street, he glanced in the rearview mirror. For a moment, he thought he saw someone sitting in the back seat, their eyes glowing faintly in the darkness. He nearly veered off the road but forced himself to keep going, his knuckles white against the steering wheel. Lisa, trapped in the library, finally mustered the courage to peek under the office door. She lowered herself to the floor, her hands trembling. Through the tiny crack, she saw nothing. Just the empty hallway beyond. But as she exhaled in relief, a face suddenly appeared, upside down, staring directly at her. Its eyes were hollow, its smile wide and unnatural. Lisa screamed, scrambling away from the door, her body shaking uncontrollably. And just as they thought they might escape, or perhaps find answers, the night took an even darker turn.